All right. Well, it's wonderful to be here today. I'm Laurie Williams from NC State University, talking about software security. And so I'll start out with just a little bit about, what's going on now. Not the future of software security, but what's going on now. And so one of the things that dealing with is people who are just attackers for money. And this is an example on the left. It's a couple years old, but there were attackers who got into the Colonial Pipeline and stopped gas flow, automobile gas flow on the East Coast for a couple of days. And so I was part of that. But the main thing is, if you look at what Brad Smith says, the president of Microsoft, is that there's a growing privatization, there's a growing industry, a $12 billion industry of people who are attacking for the money. And the Colonial Pipeline hackers say, we actually didn't mean to make all that chaos, we just wanted the money. So that's one thing. And then also Verizon Data Breach Report is a report that they study worldwide annually. And last year what they said was they've never before seen the attackers coming out swinging the way they are now. And these are financially motivated criminals as well as nation-state actors. So the state of what's going on with security is like every trend that you see is getting worse. And so although this is the future of software security, I'll also say now is the time. This is the time now that we can't wait to the future. We have to look at it now. And this conference is made up of research, education, and practice. And so, as researchers, one thing we need to do is to understand and address practical security problems. Educators need to educate students. So in the beginning, they learn to code securely. So they don't have to learn to code and then, then to do it securely, you do these things. And then practice, there's practitioners here, is to use a secure software development lifecycle. And as an aside, in the US, because of supply chain attacks, which I'll talk about in a moment, now if you want to sell to the US government, there's this self-attestation requirement, which means you have to, quote unquote, use good software security practices. So as a software security person, that's good news that people are being forced to do it. So it's really a hair on fire kind of situation, meaning, it's chaos. But one thing that I'm in my sabbatical right now, and one thing that I do here is when I ask people in industry, how do you learn about what's going on, what the latest thing is going on, they actually say, practitioners actually say, we read academic papers. So what a tremendous opportunity we have now to have a practical impact. And so animation came off a little bit, but happy that there's 8 tracks on software security at ICSE. That's wonderful that we are addressing software security in this conference. As we do, our researchers, we can either work on the state of the art or the state of the practice. Where the state of the art, our stakeholders are other researchers. We're more in theory, and we're, our audience is people who will build upon our work, researchers that will build upon our work. State of the practice says we really want to have a more near-term direct impact. And so, what I'll just say about that is that there's real problems out there now. And the more researchers can work, listen to what's going on and attack real problems and have impact right now would be great. And the impact is on practitioners, security analysts, educators, tool vendors. How can we help them out? That person with their head in their hand is a practitioner who's overwhelmed because now they have to produce functionality really quickly and have it be secure. And it really disrupts their workflow. And that's something, again, as researchers, we need to be thinking about is, how do we automate this? How do we minimize the impact on the workflow as we make more secure software? So the attacker is a persona we just can't leave to the security people. So whatever research, whatever education, whatever you're doing, as much of a positive person as I try to be, you have to turn it around and think about how could this be used for bad? How could people, the attackers take advantage of this across the entire software development lifecycle? And so in security, we often talk about prevention, detection, and response. So how do you prevent a vulnerability in the first place? How do you detect one that's already there? And how do you respond? And as software engineers, we need to be thinking about all three of those. And so from a prevention standpoint, it's the requirements phase, architecture and design phase, implementation phase, and then build and deploy as code. So you hear things like infrastructure as code. That code is as much code as anything else's code. It can have security vulnerabilities, and it really impacts the environment. And so from our standpoint, we do need to be thinking about all of those. I didn't really do an in-depth analysis of the 8 sessions, but I think that the prevention is probably the least approach by us. And we need to be thinking about how do we get it into that stage. And then the next is detecting. I think we've done quite a bit. I think most of the papers, security papers in this conference are in vulnerability discovery. And to some degree, so build and test as code. So what are the vulnerabilities in infrastructure as code and GitHub scripts and whatnot. Not as much, but a lot on vulnerability discovery. So that's great that we are addressing that. And then response. So how do we fix vulnerabilities quickly? How do we debug them? How do we deploy them to customers very rapidly? Because it's kind of an emergency situation is something that we can look at. And so I'm going to give a brief case study on software supply chain security, which is what I spend essentially all of my time now. Sonatype is an organization that does some data analysis, and they recently said that there's a 747% average increase over the last 3 years on software supply chain attacks. So software supply chain attack are all of the open source, all of the the components in an ecosystem, the build infrastructure, the people who develop the software are all part of the software supply chain. And I would love any collaborators. So if you're interested in the topics I'm going to go through briefly, would love to collaborate with you. We have a large $9 million grant in the US, and we would love international collaborators. So what I'll talk about now are the 4 major attack vectors of software supply chain. One of the attack vectors, so attack vectors, what are attackers use to get in? So one of them is accidental vulnerability injected. So that's happened forever. A developer accidentally puts a vulnerability into a component that's in the ecosystem. People download that component. The component or the vulnerability is discovered, and attackers exploit it. Log4j, if you follow software supply chain, was an example of that. That poor developer who put that in there and caused havoc throughout the world, but that's what's been going on for a long time. The growth is really in especially the next 2 attack vectors and a little bit maybe on the 4th. So a new attack vector in supply chain is using codependencies as an attack vector or using codependencies as a weapon. So that means attackers explicitly putting malicious code into open source so that people download it and then they can exploit it. And that's something that's happening more and more that really wasn't happening more than a few years ago. An example of that is Node IPC, which is a popular component. Back at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there was someone who put into Node IPC a test. If your IP address is in Russia, we're going to delete your files. And that went on for a bit until GitHub took it down. But that's an example of what attackers can do. And then another new attack vector is to use the build infrastructure as an attack vector. So you may have heard of SolarWinds and CodeCov as 2 prominent attacks. And what those do is really look using the compile, deploy, build pipeline as an attack vector. And that's something that hasn't happened much before, and it's really an area that needs a lot of research because industry is really trying to grapple with that. And the newest attack vector in supply chain are those, generative AI, LL, the large language models as an attack vector. And in this attack vector, there's a lot of code being generated, as we just heard. And if the training data has vulnerabilities in it, then the generated code will have vulnerabilities in it. And that's more of the accidental injection, but also more increasingly, they're finding ways to put vulnerable code into the training data so that more vulnerable code is generated. Something that we really need to get a handle on. And then the last thing is just humans. So everything I talked about before is technical, but humans are important to be thinking about, whether humans be attackers or software developers that are now overwhelmed by everything that's going on. And so trusting trust. So it's the humans in the supply chain that we need to deal with. And there was way back in 1984, Ken Thompson had a Trusting Trust Turing Award, and he said, to what extent should one trust the statement of a program is free of Trojan horses? Perhaps it's more important to trust the people who wrote the software. So important to be thinking about that. And to finalize, so now is the time to work on security, but we can also think about software security in the future as well. From a research standpoint, we need to make sure we're listening and understanding for the practical problems and getting more research in the areas of prevention and responding, because there's not as much research there. And then the science of security. How could we actually develop a science of security to get underneath what the attacker's doing rather than reactionary? Education, as I mentioned before, teach students to develop securely. And then in practice, always remembering the attacker persona, and then fitting these software security practices into your workflow so that they're as natural as brushing your teeth. You'd never want to not brush your teeth. You'd never want to develop insecure code. All right.